You tell a child not to touch something, and within seconds they're reaching for exactly that thing. You're warned not to think about a specific topic, and it becomes the only thing on your mind. A rule gets introduced, and suddenly the thing the rule restricts feels more appealing than it ever did before the rule existed. Someone tells you what you should do with your own life, and you find yourself wanting to do precisely the opposite. Not because the opposite is necessarily better, but because something in you needs to prove that you still can. This pattern isn't immaturity, and it isn't simply stubbornness. It's a specific, well-documented psychological mechanism operating in virtually every human mind, in virtually every context where choice feels restricted, and understanding it reveals something important not just about why people resist being told what to do, but about how the experience of freedom itself works inside your brain. By the end of this video, you'll understand why prohibiting something almost always increases its perceived value, why unsolicited advice so consistently backfires, and why some of the most well-intentioned efforts to change behavior, from parenting strategies to public health campaigns, fail specifically because they violate the one psychological principle that overrides almost everything else. Stay with this until the end, because the final part explains something that will change how you give advice, set rules, and try to influence people you actually care about. The mechanism has a name: psychological reactance. It was first formally described by social psychologist Jack Brem in 1966 in a theory that proposed a simple but powerful idea: that humans have a felt sense of behavioral freedom, and when that freedom is threatened or eliminated, they experience a specific motivational state oriented toward restoring it. Brem called this state reactance, and its defining feature is that it operates even when the restricted behavior wasn't particularly desirable beforehand. The desirability isn't the starting point. The threat to freedom is. This explains what's actually happening when a rule or prohibition suddenly makes something more appealing than it was before. You're not responding to any new information about the value of the restricted thing. You're responding to the threat itself. Your mind assigns elevated importance to the restricted choice not because the restriction revealed something about its quality, but because the restriction represents a contraction of the space of options you felt you had available. And that contraction is experienced as a direct threat to something the human mind treats as genuinely fundamental: the sense that you are the author of your own choices. Here's the specific mechanism. When a behavioral freedom is threatened, reactance produces three simultaneous effects. First, the restricted behavior or option becomes subjectively more attractive. The forbidden fruit effect, which is not a metaphor, but a measurable shift in preference that occurs even when the restricted option was previously neutral or unappealing. Second, you experience a motivational push toward performing or obtaining the restricted behavior, specifically for the purpose of demonstrating that the freedom still exists. Third, you may develop negative attitudes toward the source of the restriction, the person, institution, or rule perceived as responsible for threatening your autonomy. None of these effects require the original restriction to be unreasonable. All three can occur in response to a completely rational, well-intentioned limit, simply because the limit was perceived as a threat to freedom regardless of its content. This has direct, practical consequences for how persuasion and behavior change actually work or fail to work. Research consistently shows that telling people what to do, warning them against specific choices, or framing health and safety information as restrictions or prohibitions frequently produces outcomes the opposite of what was intended. Anti-drug campaigns that focus heavily on prohibition have been repeatedly found to generate higher rates of drug interest among the population exposed to them compared to control groups. Parental restrictions delivered as commands rather than explanations produce greater interest in restricted media content, not less. Warning labels that emphasize prohibition, do not language, can actually increase the attractiveness of the warned against behavior, particularly among individuals with higher baseline reactance. The underlying dynamic is consistent across all these cases. Any communication that implies you don't have a choice, or that someone else is deciding for you, activates the same restoration of freedom mechanism regardless of whether the content of the message is accurate, helpful, or in your objective best interest. Your brain is not evaluating the logic of the argument. It's evaluating the structure of the social interaction. And the moment that structure feels like your autonomy is being controlled rather than respected, the motivation to resist becomes active, often overriding whatever receptivity you might have had to the actual content being communicated. And here's where it becomes most directly relevant to everyday relationships. This mechanism is specifically active in response to unsolicited advice. When someone offers guidance you didn't request about your career, your relationship, your health, your choices, even when the advice is entirely accurate and genuinely useful, the act of offering it contains an implicit message about your competence and autonomy. It suggests, structurally, that you need guidance you weren't managing to. Arrive it on your own. This perceived implication is often enough to trigger reactance, producing resistance to advice that you might have welcomed and potentially would have arrived at yourself if the delivery hadn't activated the autonomy-protection mechanism first. This is why one of the most common experiences in close relationships is being given excellent advice and immediately not wanting to follow it. Not because the advice is wrong, but because being told what to do creates a need to demonstrate that you could have chosen otherwise. The advice's quality is almost irrelevant to this dynamic. Its unsolicited nature is what activates the mechanism. Ironically, this means the people who care most about you and therefore offer guidance most frequently are also the people most likely to regularly trigger your reactance, creating a frustrating pattern where the most well-meaning input often produces the least receptive response. Now here's something important. Reactance isn't simply an irrational quirk to be overcome. It serves a genuine function. The drive to maintain behavioral freedom is connected to something psychologically real and valuable. The sense of being an agent in your own life, capable of self-determination, not simply a subject being managed by external forces. People with higher reactance tend to be more independent thinkers, more resistant to manipulation, and more likely to question authority in ways that can be socially beneficial. The mechanism becomes problematic not because the underlying drive is wrong, but because it can be triggered by genuinely benign, well-intentioned input and can cause people to reject helpful guidance for no reason other than the format it was delivered in. So what do you do with this, both in terms of how you receive influence and how you offer it? First, when you find yourself resisting something, pause to ask whether the resistance is actually about the content, whether the restricted or recommended thing is genuinely wrong for you, or whether it's primarily about the structure of the situation. Are you reacting to the logic of what's being proposed, or to the implicit message that your freedom to choose has been constrained? This distinction matters because the two call for completely different responses. Resistance based on content is information. Resistance based on structure is often noise. Second, if you want to influence someone else's behavior, especially someone you're close to, delivering information rather than directives, and framing choices rather than reducing them, consistently outperforms direct instruction. I read something interesting about this. Here's what I found produces less reactance than "you should do this." Questions produce less reactance than statements. Expanding the perceived space of options produces less reactance than narrowing it, even when the practical advice is identical in both framings. Third, when you're setting limits, with children, with yourself, in a professional context, coupling any restriction with a clear, transparent rationale significantly reduces reactance compared to issuing restrictions without explanation. The mechanism is partly driven by the perception that freedom is being removed without justification, which feels like control. An explained restriction still reduces options, but does so in a way that respects the other person's capacity to evaluate the reasoning, which partially preserves the felt sense of autonomous judgment. Here's what ties this together. The reason prohibitions increase desire, advice gets rejected, and rules breed resistance isn't irrationality or childishness. It's a fundamental, adaptive mechanism that exists specifically to protect your sense of being the author of your own choices. That mechanism doesn't evaluate the content of what's being restricted. It evaluates the structure, and any structure that feels like autonomy is being controlled rather than respected Triggers. A predictable, powerful motivational force aimed at restoring the freedom that's perceived as under threat. Understanding this doesn't make you immune to it, but it does let you catch yourself mid-reaction and ask the one question that matters most. Am I resisting this because it's actually wrong for me, or simply because someone told me I couldn't have it? If this explains something you've noticed in yourself, tell us in the comments about a time when being told not to do something made you want to do it more, and whether looking back, the restriction was actually reasonable. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden mechanics behind your own mind, the next video is right there, waiting for you.